She was born in a small industrial town where mornings smelled of dust and metal and evenings were filled with tired silence. Her name was rarely remembered outside her family and school records, and even there it carried no weight. Her parents worked long hours and spoke little about dreams because survival always came first. From a young age, she learned to stay quiet and observant, and she developed a habit of listening more than speaking. While other children ran through the streets shouting, she preferred sitting near open windows listening to sounds drifting from nearby homes and shops. Radios played old songs, and sometimes a distant church hall echoed with music during practice hours. Those sounds stirred something gentle and persistent inside her, though she had no words for it yet. At school, she was an average student, and teachers rarely noticed her unless attendance was taken. She was polite and followed rules and finished her work on time, but she never stood out. During breaks, she sat alone or with one friend who moved away later. Her classmates formed groups and shared jokes that she did not understand. They talked about sports and parties and new phones while she listened and nodded. She often felt invisible, and that feeling slowly became familiar and safe because it meant she was rarely questioned or challenged. Yet inside, she carried a growing sense of longing that she could not explain. One afternoon when she was 10 years old, her class was taken to the assembly hall for a small cultural program. A local music teacher had come with a few students to perform simple pieces on different instruments. There was a violin, a guitar, and finally a piano that had been rolled onto the stage with care. The moment the first keys were pressed, she felt something shift inside her chest. The sound was soft at first, then fuller and warmer, and it filled the hall in a way that made everything else disappear. She forgot about the whispers and the hard chairs and the dusty air. She only felt the rise and fall of the melody and the calm strength in the hands of the girl playing. That night she could not sleep. The sound of the piano followed her even in silence. She imagined her own fingers touching the keys and creating something beautiful and steady. She knew nothing about music and no one in her family played instruments, but the desire felt natural and urgent. The next morning she asked her mother what a piano cost and whether people like them could ever have one. Her mother smiled gently and said pianos were for rich families and music schools in big cities. She said it was nice to like music, but it was better to focus on practical things. The conversation ended there, but the feeling did not. Over the next few years, she found excuses to be near music whenever possible. She volunteered to help clean the assembly hall just to sit near the old piano that was rarely used. She pressed keys softly when no one was around and listened closely to the sounds she made. Sometimes a teacher would hear and tell her to stop, but she always returned when she could. She did not tell anyone about this secret because she feared it would sound foolish. In her world, dreams were fragile things that broke easily when spoken aloud. When she entered secondary school, the pressure to choose a path became stronger. Teachers talked about careers and exams and expectations. Her classmates began to define themselves by what they wanted to become. Doctors, engineers, athletes, and influencers filled the air with confidence. She felt more uncertain than ever. Music still lived quietly inside her, but it seemed more distant now, like a memory that belonged to another life. She told herself it was childish to hold on to it. Still, whenever she passed the music room and heard scales or exercises, she slowed her steps and listened until the door closed. One day, during a class discussion about talents, the teacher asked if anyone had a skill they wished to develop further. The room buzzed with raised hands and confident voices. Without fully understanding why, she felt her own hand lift slowly. The teacher noticed and smiled, inviting her to speak. Her heart raced and her face warmed as all eyes turned toward her. She swallowed and said she wanted to learn to play the piano. The room fell quiet for a brief moment before laughter broke out from several corners. Some students looked surprised, others amused. A boy in the back mimicked dramatic piano playing, and a few girls whispered and laughed behind their hands. The teacher tried to restore order and asked her calmly why she felt that way. She struggled to find the right words and simply said it made her feel calm and focused. The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. More laughter followed, and someone muttered that she should learn something useful. The teacher nodded politely and moved on to the next student. The moment passed, but the weight of it stayed with her. She kept her eyes down for the rest of the day and barely spoke when spoken to. That evening, she walked home slower than usual. The streets felt longer and the familiar building seemed colder. She replayed the scene again and again, wondering why she had spoken at all. Shame settled in her chest and mixed with anger toward herself. She felt foolish for thinking that something as simple and pure as a love for music could belong to her. When she reached home, she went straight to her room and closed the door. She did not cry loudly or throw things. She sat on her bed and stared at her hands, imagining them on piano keys that no longer felt within reach. As the days passed, the laughter did not fade completely. Some classmates teased her lightly, others ignored it, but she felt marked by the moment. She became quieter and more withdrawn. Teachers noticed but assumed it was exam stress. At home, she said nothing because she did not want to worry her parents or hear more practical advice, yet something inside her began to change. The embarrassment slowly turned into resolve. She realized that the pain she felt came not only from the laughter, but from the possibility that she might give up on something that mattered deeply to her. Late one night, while everyone slept, she searched old books and borrowed magazines looking for stories about musicians and how they began. She read about people who started late and people who faced ridicule and hardship. These stories did not erase her fear, but they gave it context. She understood for the first time that wanting something deeply often meant standing alone at the beginning. The idea settled quietly and firmly in her mind. She did not know how or when, but she knew she could not let the laughter be the final word. Part 1 of her story closed with a simple decision that no one else heard or saw. She would find a way to learn even if it meant walking a path that led away from familiar places. The laughter had drawn a line in her life, and instead of shrinking behind it, she felt herself preparing to cross it. She did not yet know where that crossing would take her, but she sensed it would change everything. The next weeks unfolded quietly, but with a new intensity inside her that she had never felt before. She continued going to school, following the same routine, sitting in the same seat, walking the same corridors, yet everything felt slightly different. The laughter from that day still echoed in her mind, but instead of crushing her, it pushed her forward in small, determined ways. She began to watch the music teacher more closely, noticing when the classroom was unlocked and when students came and went. She learned the rhythm of the school beyond lessons and bells, and found moments where the piano was left alone, waiting in silence. She started staying after school under the excuse of completing assignments or helping clean classrooms. Most days she did not touch the piano at all. She simply sat nearby, letting herself feel comfortable in its presence. On days when the room was empty, she lifted the cover and pressed a single key, listening to the sound fade into the air. She repeated this again and again, learning how different keys felt under her fingers. There was no method or structure, only curiosity and patience. Each sound felt like a small victory because it belonged to her alone. At home, life remained practical and predictable. Her parents talked about bills, work, and responsibilities, and she listened quietly as always. She helped with chores and finished her homework without complaint. She did not mention the piano or her growing determination because she feared it would be dismissed as unrealistic. Still, she noticed that even after long days, she felt more awake than before. Her mind replayed sounds and imagined patterns, and she found herself tapping rhythms on tables and notebooks. Music had begun to shape her inner world even without formal lessons. One afternoon, the music teacher entered the room while she was pressing keys softly. She froze, expecting scolding or ridicule. Instead, the teacher watched quietly for a moment before asking how long she had been playing. She admitted she was not really playing and that she had no training. The teacher listened carefully and then asked her to try again. Nervous but hopeful, she played the few notes she remembered from listening to others. They were uneven and hesitant but sincere. The teacher nodded and said she had a good ear and asked why she had not joined music class earlier. She told the truth about the laughter and the fear of being judged. The teacher sighed and said many students laughed at what they did not understand. She explained that talent often begins as curiosity and that discipline mattered more than early praise. She offered to let her practice after school a few days a week under supervision. There would be no promises and no performances, just learning and effort. The offer felt unreal, like a door opening where there had only been a wall. She accepted immediately, trying to hide her excitement. The first proper practice session was overwhelming. She learned how to sit correctly, how to place her hands, and how to listen to herself. Her fingers felt stiff and uncooperative, and her mind struggled to remember instructions. She made mistakes constantly and felt embarrassed by how difficult it was. Yet there was also joy in the struggle because every correction made sense and every small improvement felt earned. The teacher was firm but patient and reminded her that progress was rarely loud or dramatic. It happened quietly over time. Word spread slowly among students that she stayed after school to practice piano. Some reacted with curiosity, others with mild teasing, but the laughter was softer, now less confident. She avoided conversations and focused on her routine. Each afternoon, she practiced scales, simple exercises, and short melodies. She began to recognize patterns and understand how music was built. The piano no longer felt like a distant dream, but a demanding companion that required attention and honesty. On difficult days, she left feeling frustrated, but she always returned. Balancing schoolwork and practice was not easy. She often stayed up late studying and woke early to finish assignments. There were moments when exhaustion made her question her choice. Friends she barely had noticed her absence during breaks, and teachers reminded her to focus on exams. Still, she felt more like herself than ever before. The piano gave her a sense of direction that no timetable could offer. It was not an escape from reality, but a way of engaging with it more fully. At home, her parents began to notice the change. She seemed more focused and less withdrawn. When they asked, she said she was helping a teacher after school. Eventually, the truth came out during a parent meeting. The music teacher spoke positively about her dedication and potential. Her parents were surprised and unsure. They worried about distractions and future prospects, but they also saw her sincerity. After long discussions, they agreed to let her continue as long as her grades did not suffer. It was not full support, but it was permission, and that was enough. As months passed, her confidence grew quietly. She no longer flinched when entering the music room. Her hands moved with more purpose, and her ear caught mistakes quickly. She learned to practice patiently repeating difficult sections until they improved. She also learned to accept slow days without despair. Music taught her resilience in a way nothing else had. It demanded consistency and rewarded honesty. There were no shortcuts and no applause, only the steady accumulation of effort. One evening after practice, she overheard two students talking about her. One said she was serious about the piano, and the other said they had misjudged her. The words were not meant for her, but they reached her anyway. She did not feel pride or revenge, only a calm confirmation that perseverance changed perceptions more than arguments ever could. She walked home under fading light, feeling tired but grounded. Part 2 of her journey ended not with triumph but with stability. She had built a quiet foundation through effort, patience, and guidance. The laughter that once defined her fear had lost its power. In its place stood routine, discipline, and a growing belief that her path, though uncertain, was real and worth following. As the new school year began, she stepped into it carrying a different kind of weight, one that came from responsibility rather than fear. And this weight shaped her days in subtle ways that only she could feel, because her routine now revolved around discipline and intention instead of avoidance and silence. And every morning she woke with a sense of purpose that pushed her out of bed even when exhaustion lingered. From the night before, her practice sessions grew longer and more demanding, and the music teacher began introducing more complex pieces that required coordination between both hands and deeper listening. And at first these pieces felt impossible, because her fingers lagged behind her thoughts and frustration rose quickly. Yet she learned to slow down, to isolate mistakes, and to repeat passages patiently until muscle memory formed. And through this process she discovered that progress was not a straight line but a series of steps forward and backward. At school, her classmates noticed the change in her posture and focus, though few commented openly, because she no longer invited attention and no longer shrank from it either. And this quiet confidence altered how others interacted with her, because they sensed a boundary that had not existed before. And while some still dismissed her efforts, others began asking questions about music out of curiosity rather than mockery, which surprised her, because it showed that effort softened resistance over time. One afternoon, the school announced auditions for a small winter recital meant to showcase students from different activities, and the music teacher encouraged her to consider participating. And this suggestion filled her with conflicting emotions, because part of her longed to prove how far she had come, while another part remembered the laughter and the exposure and the vulnerability of standing alone in front of others. And for several nights she struggled to decide, replaying both the humiliation and the growth. Her mind. Eventually she agreed to audition, not because she felt ready, but because she realized she might never feel ready, and waiting for certainty would only delay her progress. And the audition itself was simple, performed in front of two teachers in an empty hall, yet her hands trembled and her heart pounded as she played a short piece she had practiced for weeks. And though she made small mistakes, she maintained her rhythm and finished with composure, and the teachers nodded approvingly, acknowledging her effort and improvement. Being selected for the recital brought a new level of pressure, because now her practice carried the weight of expectation and the awareness that others would listen and judge. And this pressure affected her sleep and concentration, because every mistake felt magnified and every session felt like a test of her worth. And during this time she learned that fear did not disappear with progress, but evolved into new forms that required different kinds of strength. Her parents reacted cautiously to the news of the recital, because public performances felt risky and uncertain to them. But they also saw her commitment and the seriousness with which she approached preparation. And for the first time they attended a practice session, quietly sitting in the back of the room and watching her play. And though they did not fully understand the music, they recognized the discipline and focus in her posture and the sincerity in her effort, and this recognition created a fragile bridge of understanding between them. As the recital date approached, the school environment shifted, because students rehearsed their own acts and excitement filled the corridors, and she found herself surrounded by energy that was both motivating and overwhelming. And during breaks, she often sought quiet corners to breathe and visualize her performance, imagining calm, steady hands and controlled breathing. And she practiced mental rehearsal as carefully as physical practice, understanding that confidence was built as much in the mind as in the fingers. The day of the recital arrived with cold air and nervous anticipation, and she wore simple clothes chosen for comfort rather than attention. And as she waited backstage, she listened to other performances and felt a mixture of admiration and doubt, wondering whether she truly belonged among them. And when her name was called, she walked onto the stage under bright lights that erased the audience into a blur. And for a moment, the old fear surged, threatening to freeze her in place. She sat at the piano, adjusted her bench, and took a deep breath, grounding herself in the familiarity of the instrument. And as her fingers touched the keys, muscle memory guided her through the opening notes, and gradually the world narrowed to sound and movement. And the piece unfolded with a fragile clarity that reflected both her limitations and her honesty. And when she finished, there was a brief silence followed by applause that felt distant yet real, and she stood, bowed slightly, and returned backstage with a racing heart and shaking hands. The applause did not transform her life instantly, and it did not erase all doubt, but it marked a turning point because it replaced ridicule with recognition, and showed her that vulnerability paired with preparation could lead to acceptance. And afterward, classmates congratulated her with genuine surprise, and teachers offered encouragement. And even those who had laughed before avoided her gaze, unsure how to reconcile their past behavior with her present reality. In the days following the recital, she experienced an emotional lull, because the intense focus that had driven her suddenly lifted, leaving space for reflection and fatigue. And she questioned what came next, whether this was a peak or a beginning. And during this period, the music teacher reminded her that performances were milestones, not destinations, and that growth continued quietly in practice rooms long after applause faded. And these words resonated deeply because they aligned with her lived experience. She returned to her routine with renewed clarity, understanding that her journey was personal and not defined by external validation. And she set new goals focused on technique, expression, and consistency rather than recognition. And this shift allowed her to reconnect with the joy that had first drawn her to the piano before fear and ambition complicated it. And she found satisfaction in mastering difficult passages and understanding musical structure more deeply. Part 3 of her story settled into this phase of integration where confidence and humility balanced each other, and where she learned that progress required both courage to step forward and patience to remain committed. And though challenges lay ahead, she now trusted her ability to face them because she had already crossed one of the hardest thresholds by choosing to be seen and heard on her own terms. After the recital, life did not slow down, it simply changed shape, and she felt this shift in the way her days stretched longer and demanded more from her because expectations had quietly increased, and people now associated her with music, whether she wanted that label or not. And this brought both opportunity and pressure that she had never experienced before. The music teacher began challenging her with pieces that required emotional control rather than just technical accuracy, and this forced her to confront parts of herself she had always kept hidden, because music now asked her to express feelings she had learned to suppress, such as disappointment, longing, and quiet anger. And during practice, she often paused, not because of mistakes, but because memories surfaced and her hands hesitated, as if unsure whether they were allowed to speak those truths. At the same time, academic pressure intensified as important exams approached, and teachers reminded students that these results would shape their futures. And she felt torn between two demanding worlds, because music required time, patience, and energy, while school demanded focus and performance, and balancing both felt like walking a narrow path where one misstep could lead to failure. And this tension followed her even into sleep, leaving her tired and restless. Her parents grew more vocal about concerns as they noticed how late she stayed awake practicing or studying. And though their words were rooted in care, they often sounded like doubt, and they asked her practical questions about careers and stability, and whether music could ever offer security, and she struggled to answer because she did not yet know what form her future would take. And this uncertainty created distance between them, even as they tried to stay supportive. At school, reactions continued to evolve as some students now treated her with respect, while others kept their distance, unsure how to engage. And she noticed that admiration could be as isolating as ridicule, because it placed her on a quiet pedestal that limited honest connection. And she missed the simplicity of being unnoticed, yet she understood that growth often came with loneliness, and learning to carry it was part of maturity. One afternoon, the music teacher informed her about a regional youth music program that offered weekend workshops and mentorship for dedicated students. And the opportunity felt both exciting and intimidating, because it meant stepping beyond the safety of her school environment into a space filled with strangers who likely had years of formal training and resources she lacked. And the thought of being the least experienced person in the room stirred old insecurities she thought she had overcome. After days of reflection, she decided to apply, understanding that avoidance would only preserve fear, and the application process required a short performance recording and a written statement about her relationship with music, and writing that statement forced her to articulate a journey she had mostly lived in silence. And as she described her beginnings, her struggles, and her persistence, she realized how far she had come, not just in skill, but in self-awareness. When she was accepted into the program, her reaction was quiet relief rather than celebration, because she knew acceptance was only the beginning. And the first workshop confirmed her fears, as she met students who spoke fluently about composers, techniques, and performances. And she felt small and underprepared, yet she also noticed that dedication varied, and that raw passion and work ethic mattered as much as background, and this observation steadied her nerves. During these workshops, she received feedback that was direct and sometimes uncomfortable because mentors pointed out weaknesses she had not noticed and challenged habits she had developed on her own. And at first, this criticism stung, but she learned to separate her identity from her performance, understanding that correction was a tool for growth, not a judgment of worth. And this mindset shift became one of the most important lessons of her journey. Traveling to and from the program required sacrifices, as weekends once reserved for rest or family now involved long commutes and intense sessions, and fatigue accumulated. But she felt alive in a way that justified the effort, and she began to envision a future where music was not just a private refuge, but a serious pursuit that demanded commitment and resilience. Her parents watched this transformation with mixed emotions as pride slowly outweighed fear, and though they still worried, they began adjusting routines to support her schedule. And this quiet cooperation meant more to her than words because it signaled trust and belief that she was capable of navigating her own path responsibly. Back at school, she became more selective with her time, choosing solitude over distractions and quality over quantity in friendships. And this intentionality refined her focus, but also tested her emotional endurance, because moments of doubt still surfaced, especially when progress plateaued or exhaustion blurred motivation. And during those times, she returned to the memory of why she began listening again to the simple joy that first drew her to sound. Part 4 of her story rested in this demanding middle ground where ambition met reality and where growth required letting go of comfort and embracing uncertainty. And she learned that persistence was not loud or dramatic, but steady and often invisible. And though the road ahead remained unclear, she continued forward, guided by a deeper understanding of herself and a commitment that no laughter or doubt could undo. A commitment that no laughter or doubt could undo. The pressure of growth began to show itself more clearly during this stage of her life, because the further she moved forward, the more complex everything became. And she started to understand that commitment did not only demand time and effort, but also emotional endurance and self-honesty, which were far harder to maintain. When fatigue and doubt crept in quietly at the regional program, she was no longer the quiet observer she had once been, because mentors expected participation, questions, visible effort, and this forced her to speak up even when uncertainty lingered in her voice. And each time she shared her thoughts, she felt exposed, yet gradually, she realized that vulnerability was common among serious learners, and that confidence often grew from shared struggle rather than flawless performance. Her technique improved steadily, but unevenly, and there were days when her hands felt disconnected from her intentions, making simple passages feel heavy and unresponsive. And on those days, frustration threatened to undo her motivation because progress seemed to vanish without warning, and she questioned whether she had reached her limit, or whether talent had finally drawn a line she could not cross. During one particularly difficult workshop, a mentor stopped her mid-performance and asked her to begin again, but this time to forget precision and focus only on meaning. And this instruction confused her at first because she had spent years chasing correctness and avoiding mistakes. Yet when she allowed herself to play imperfectly but honestly, something shifted, and the music felt fuller, more alive. And the mentor nodded, explaining that technique served expression, not the other way around. This moment changed how she approached practice, because she began listening more deeply, not only to sound, but to intention, and she learned to ask herself what she wanted to say through each phrase rather than how to avoid error. And this reframing eased some of her anxiety, because it allowed space for humanity within discipline and reminded her that music was communication before it was execution. Back home, responsibilities continued to pile up, and academic expectations reached their peak as exams drew closer. And she often studied late into the night before waking early to practice quietly so as not to disturb others. And this routine tested her physical limits, and there were mornings when exhaustion made her hands tremble and her thoughts blur, yet she persisted, driven by a sense that this period, though difficult, was shaping her resilience. Her parents noticed the toll and worried about burnout, and one evening they sat together discussing balance and health and future choices. And for the first time, she spoke openly about her fears of failing both academically and musically, and her fear of disappointing them and herself. And this conversation, though heavy, brought relief, because it replaced assumptions with understanding and allowed mutual support to take a more honest form. At school, she faced a different kind of challenge as attention from teachers increased, and some peers viewed her as an example or a standard, which created pressure to perform consistently. And she learned that being seen could be as demanding as being ignored, because it came with expectations that left little room for rest or missteps. And navigating this visibility required emotional boundaries. She was still learning to build. There were moments when she longed for simplicity, when music was a secret and effort went unnoticed. But she also recognized that growth rarely allowed retreat without cost, and that every stage demanded a new version of strength and acceptance. And this understanding helped her endure periods of loneliness and self-doubt with greater patience. As the year progressed, opportunities emerged, including the possibility of a scholarship audition connected to the regional program, and this prospect felt daunting, because it represented a tangible turning point where music could shape her future more concretely, and the audition requirements were demanding, requiring a level of preparation and consistency that pushed her beyond comfort and forced her to confront her readiness honestly. Preparing for this audition became a central focus, and she structured her days with precision, allocating time for technique, repertoire study, and rest. And she learned to value recovery as much as effort, understanding that sustainability mattered more than intensity alone. And this holistic approach marked a maturation in her discipline, reflecting a deeper respect for both her craft and her well-being. Emotionally, she fluctuated between hope and fear, imagining both success and rejection, and she practiced mental resilience by reminding herself that effort itself carried value regardless of outcome, and that defining her worth solely by results would undermine the very joy that sustained her. And this internal dialogue became a quiet anchor during uncertain moments. Part 5 of her story settled into this phase of testing, where growth was measured not only by skill, but by balance, honesty, and endurance. And she learned that pursuing a dream was less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about showing up consistently with patience and courage, even when progress felt slow and invisible. And though the path remained challenging, she continued forward, grounded in a deeper understanding of why she chose to walk. At the period leading up to the scholarship audition became one of the most intense stretches of her life, because everything she had built now seemed to narrow toward a single moment, and this compression of time and expectation changed how she experienced each day, because nothing felt casual anymore, and every choice carried weight. She woke before sunrise most mornings, practicing quietly while the world was still asleep. And those early hours felt both lonely and sacred, because they belonged entirely to her and the piano. And in that silence, she confronted her weaknesses, honestly repeating difficult passages, until frustration softened into understanding, and she learned to sit with discomfort, then rushing past it, which strengthened not only her playing but her patience. As the audition approached, doubt returned in waves, especially when she compared herself to others in the program who spoke confidently about competitions and advanced techniques. And there were moments when she felt like an imposter walking a path meant for someone else. And during those moments, she reminded herself of her beginnings, of the laughter and the isolation, and the choice she made to continue anyway. And this memory grounded her, because it proved that persistence had always been her strength. The mentors at the program offered guidance that grew more precise and demanding, and they no longer softened criticism, because they believed she could handle it. And this shift was both affirming and intimidating, because it meant expectations had risen and she was being measured against a higher standard. And though some feedback stung, she absorbed it, carefully adjusting her practice to address specific issues rather than vague improvement. At home, the atmosphere shifted as well, because her parents sensed the importance of what she was preparing for, and they became quieter, more attentive. And though they still worried, they avoided discouraging words and supported her schedule in small, practical ways. And this silent support gave her emotional stability during a time when anxiety could easily have overwhelmed her. School life faded slightly into the background as exams concluded and routines loosened, and this allowed her to devote more energy to music, but it also removed familiar structure, and she had to manage her time independently, which tested her discipline. And she learned quickly that freedom without structure could lead to exhaustion. So she created her own routines, balancing practice, rest, and reflection. The day of the audition arrived without ceremony, and she traveled early, carrying only essentials and a calm she had practiced cultivating. And the venue felt unfamiliar and formal, filled with quiet intensity. And she noticed how other candidates carried themselves, some with visible confidence, others with nervous restraint. And instead of comparing, she focused inward, reminding herself that her task was not to outperform others, but to represent her own growth honestly. When her turn came, she walked into the room with steady steps and greeted the panel respectfully. And as she sat at the piano, she felt the familiar weight of expectations settle in her chest, but she had learned to coexist with that feeling rather than fight it. And as she began to play, she allowed the music to guide her attention, focusing on expression and connection rather than perfection. And though minor mistakes occurred, she did not stop or tense, and she continued with composure, letting the piece breathe naturally. The audition ended quietly with polite acknowledgement, and she left the room feeling strangely empty, because the moment she had prepared for so intensely was over, and there was nothing left to do but wait. And during the following days, anticipation lingered heavily, and she oscillated between optimism and self-criticism, replaying details and questioning choices. And she learned that waiting was its own challenge, requiring trust and patience. When the results arrived, they came without dramatic buildup. And she learned that she had been awarded partial support, which recognized her potential, but also highlighted areas for further growth. And her reaction surprised her, because instead of disappointment, she felt gratitude and clarity, because the outcome felt honest, reflecting both her progress and the distance she still needed to travel. This result shifted her perspective, because it removed the illusion of arrival and replaced it with a realistic understanding of her path. And she accepted the support with humility and resolved to continue improving, not because she needed validation, but because she genuinely wanted to deepen her relationship with music. Following the audition, her practice took on a calmer rhythm, because the immediate pressure had lifted, and she found space to explore repertoire more creatively and to reflect her identity as a musician. And she realized that music was no longer something she pursued to prove herself, but something that had become integral to how she understood the world and herself. Part 6 of her story rested in this space of reckoning, where effort met outcome and expectation met reality. And she learned that success was not defined by total victory or defeat, but by alignment between intention and action. And this understanding gave her a quiet confidence that would carry her Forward into the next stage of her journey, regardless of external recognition, the months that followed the audition unfolded with a slower rhythm, yet carried a deeper weight because the urgency of proving herself had faded. And in its place came reflection and responsibility. And she found that this stage required a different kind of strength, one rooted in consistency rather than adrenaline, and in patience rather than ambition. With partial support secured, she adjusted her expectations and plans, understanding that her journey would continue alongside practical realities. And this acceptance brought an unexpected sense of calm because she no longer felt trapped between extremes of success or failure, and instead saw her path as gradual and sustainable. And this mindset allowed her to reconnect with music as a companion rather than a battlefield. Her practice sessions became more intentional and less frantic because she focused on long-term development rather than immediate results, and she spent time analyzing pieces, understanding structure, phrasing, and emotional context. And this deeper engagement enriched her playing and gave her a sense of authorship over the music rather than imitation. And she began to feel like an interpreter with a voice rather than a student chasing approval. At the regional program, mentors noticed this shift and encouraged her to explore repertoire that challenged her emotionally rather than technically alone. And these pieces required vulnerability and restraint and taught her that maturity in music often meant knowing when not to push and when to allow silence and space to speak. And this lesson resonated beyond music, influencing how she approached conversations, relationships, and decisions. Her parents observed a steadier version of her emerging, and their concerns softened as they saw balance replace exhaustion, and they trusted her more with her time and choices. And this mutual trust strengthened their bond because it was built on observation rather than persuasion. And for the time they spoke about her future with cautious optimism rather than fear. Socially, she navigated a quieter circle, choosing depth over familiarity. And she connected with a few peers who shared similar dedication, and these relationships were grounded in mutual respect and shared effort rather than competition. And through them she learned that community did not require conformity, only honesty and commitment. At school, her final year approached and discussions about next steps intensified. And while others confidently about predetermined paths, she remained open and thoughtful, acknowledging uncertainty without panic. And this openness surprised teachers who had once viewed her as fragile, and they now recognized her resilience and independence, offering guidance without pressure. There were moments of doubt, of course, especially when she encountered obstacles or slow progress. And during these times, she returned to journaling and listening, revisiting recordings of her earlier playing, and reflecting on growth over time. And this practice grounded her, reminding her that transformation was cumulative and often invisible in daily effort. She also began mentoring a younger student who reminded her of her earlier self, quiet, unsure, and curious. And guiding the student through basic exercises and encouragement reinforced her own learning and gave her perspective on how far she had come. And she realized that teaching was another form of understanding, and that sharing knowledge deepened rather than diminished her own growth. As opportunities continued to arise, she evaluated them carefully, learning to say no when necessary and to commit fully when aligned with her values. And this discernment marked a turning point because it demonstrated ownership of her journey and respect for her limits. And she understood that sustainability required boundaries as much as ambition. Emotionally, she felt more grounded than ever before because her identity was no longer tied to a single outcome or opinion, and she carried within her the memory of laughter transformed into resolve and effort transformed into confidence. And this internal narrative became a source of quiet strength during uncertain moments. Part 7 of her story rested in this phase of integration where lessons learned were woven into daily life, and where she no longer needed to prove her worth through constant achievement. And she understood that growth was ongoing and nonlinear, and that staying true to her passion required listening as much as striving. And with this understanding, she moved forward, prepared for whatever form the next chapter might take. The final stage of her story unfolded without a single dramatic moment, yet it carried the deepest meaning, because it revealed how far she had traveled from the girl who once asked a simple question and was met with laughter, and how that moment had quietly shaped a life built on choice, effort, and inner resolve. As she prepared to leave school, she walked through familiar corridors with a sense of closure and gratitude, remembering the silence, the fear, and the determination that had carried her forward. And she no longer felt small in those spaces, because she understood that growth did not erase the past, but transformed it into foundation. And every step echoed with lessons learned through patience and courage. Her final performance at school was modest and sincere, attended by teachers, classmates, and her parents, and there was no overwhelming applause or grand recognition, but there was respect and attentiveness. And as she played, she felt grounded, connected to the music and to herself, and she understood that this feeling mattered more than validation, because it reflected alignment between who she was and what she did after graduation. She chose a balanced path, continuing formal music education while pursuing academic studies that provided stability. And this decision was not a compromise, but an integration, because it honored both her passion and her responsibility. And she approached this new chapter with realism and optimism, knowing that fulfillment came from sustained engagement rather than singular achievement. In new environments, she encountered fresh challenges and unfamiliar expectations, yet she carried with her the resilience built through years of quiet persistence. And when doubt surfaced, she returned to practice, to routine, and to reflection understanding that these anchors had never failed her, and she learned to trust the process even when outcomes remained uncertain. Music continued to evolve in her life, taking on new meanings and forms, and she played not only to improve but to connect, to express, and to listen. And she performed in small settings, taught beginners, and explored different genres, allowing curiosity to guide her rather than fear. And this openness kept her relationship with music alive and honest. Her parents watched her journey with pride and relief, seeing her navigate adulthood with balance and integrity, and their early doubts softened into respect, because they recognized that her choices were thoughtful and grounded, and that the discipline learned through music had shaped her character as much as her skill. Occasionally, she remembered the laughter from years ago not with bitterness, but with clarity, because it marked the moment when she chose herself over approval. And she understood that many people never make that choice and remain defined by fear and expectation. And this realization deepened her compassion rather than fueling resentment. When she spoke to younger students, she shared her story simply, without dramatizing struggle or success, and she emphasized consistency, patience, and self-trust, and she watched recognition flicker in their eyes just as it once had in hers. And she understood that stories did not change lives through spectacle, but through honesty and relatability. Her life did not become perfect or easy, and challenges continued to arise, but she faced them with a steadiness born of experience. And she knew how to begin again, how to practice, how to wait, and how to listen. And these skills extended beyond music, shaping how she approached relationships, work, and self-understanding. The story closed not with an ending, but with continuity, because her journey was ongoing and defined by choice rather than circumstance. And the girl who once asked to play the piano and was laughed at had become a woman who listened deeply, worked patiently, and lived authentically. And in doing so, she transformed a moment of dismissal into a lifetime of purpose and quiet fulfillment.